All right, we're going to go ahead and I'll get started with everything. So welcome back, everybody. Again, I always like to start off with attendance and just seeing how everyone's doing and seeing everyone's face. So I'm going to do that. James Anderson, seeing here, was here. Maybe he'll come in a little bit. Brett Balin. Hi, Brett. How are you today? Excellent. And T. Where's T at? Hi, T. Good morning. And Harry. Hi, Harry. How are you? Good. Sonia Darter. Sonia, anywhere? All right. August. There he is back there. Good morning. Jody Hildreth. Good morning, Jody. How are you? And Bailey is up here. Hi, Bailey. How are you? David dropped. Darieshka is back there. Good morning. And Zoe Meek. Hi, Zoe. How are you? Nick. I see Nick back there. Hi, Nick. And Austin. Good morning. And Nicola. Hi, Nicola. Oh, very good. And Gentry. I can't see it because of behind the monitors. Hi, Gentry. Yeah. And Matt Royce. Good morning. And George. Hi, George. And Lily. Good morning, Lily. And Nathaniel back there. And Emily. Good morning. How are you? And Blake Williamson. Anywhere? And Jasper? Juju Jasper?
He's gone.
He's gone? Okay. All right. Very good. Now, one of the things that I didn't do is show you my main web page. So for me, if you want to, I have a web, you can find my website at derekrdallas.com if you ever want to go there for something. You can see all the different classes that I teach in digital media, or I have taught at one point in time. Some of the stuff that I use digital media for, theater projections, and different types of images that have been used in shows. My kids were highly involved in theater, so I kind of got involved in some of the production design and the different art styles that directors would have, and we'd create visual backdrops and artwork. I do 3D modeling, 3D print, so I design stuff that, can't see it behind this, but stuff that we use in the real world here on campus. Design things that I can make for gifts like this mustache and beard comb kind of concept. I'm a drummer, so I try to make stuff for my drum set and things like this. This is a concept I had to attach to a snare drum, like a little speaker. And I don't know if you are a drummer, you want to make different sound effects and click sounds and raspy sounds, so you can drag your stick across that and hit it. So I had the idea of designing something that would have like really strong magnets that would snap to my snare, and then I could use that. And I designed it based on the golden ratio, or like a shell, like a conch shell or whatever, to try like, oh, it's like a speaker. And it actually doesn't work at all from this, but it works great if I turn it upside down. So what do you know? So I have a print of this in my office, and it's a great handheld thing, but it's not so good. So it's a concept, but that's the cool thing about it. You can come up with something, have this idea, sit down, model it out, print it out, and find out if it is going to work. So it does work. It's just not like I thought. I make stuff for home. This is a garbage disposal plunger that I use. If you ever need to shove like a whole carcass into your garbage disposal, you could use that. This is a test tube brush cleaning device, or not a test tube brush cleaning device, but a test tube cleaning device. So I worked in a lab, and I had a lot of student workers that had to clean test tubes. And if you ever cleaned a test tube, it's a pretty much one at a time type of deal. You have a test tube brush that's on a wire, and you have a test tube, and you do this for a little while until you get all the crud and junk out of it. Anybody take microbiology before? There's always auger and super nasty stuff inside those things that you got to kind of like uh, clean them. So I was trying to figure out how to increase productivity, and so I came up with some concepts and designs for sink mounted that you'd have two. So you didn't have to hold it. You could just take two test tubes and just run through the thing, and then that turned out to be super awesome because the students were having contests at that point. So I would be lucky if I would get 70 to 100 test tubes washed in a student worker work period, and then they were literally stacking. One test tube tray holds 72 test tubes. You wouldn't know that unless you worked in that days, but so I would have 4 or 5, and they'd have contests of how many they could make once I made that thing. But then it was made out of metal, so my brother had to make it. So I had to have a concept, a design, and I had to send it to someone who could fabricate something. This was before I used the computer, and my brother made it out of this metal, and it worked great. So then I started thinking, well, how could I make it better, lighter, smaller? And so I came up with this concept, and it works nicely. So anyway, so it's just ways to apply things. Oh, drum key. So anyway, so you can make all kinds of stuff with the same software. I'm using the same software you're learning right now. So everything that you just saw, you can make with this stuff, or Blender, or or something like that. So the skills that you learn, you just have to apply. I'm an animator, so I'll freelance occasionally for different companies if I want to or need to. So I've done some stuff for the state of Illinois way back for Kirby Health, and then this is sort of some theater stuff. So and then for 3D animation, where you're rendering and doing character designs, you can. This is other stuff that you can do when you get into character modeling and character animation and rigging and stuff like that. So if you like what you see on uh, like I like PBS personally, like little PBS shows that are pretty good, and you can do stuff like that. So we have little characters that you can.
He'll be made into marshmallows in 5 seconds.
It's impossible, my dear lady. That's absurd.
Anyway, you can go to the website and look at all that. Look at that stuff. So that's a little bit about kind of me, how I apply this stuff. I try to model and work on stuff as much as possible and not get caught when I'm in my office. So it's nice because I have access to a lot of this stuff, and it's just engaging and super fun, super challenging all the time. So as you start learning, that's what I mean by applying the stuff. I'm always trying to learn, always trying to understand things. So I do lots of little projects to try to do that. So anyway, if you want to check that out, you can go there and see all. These are links to the classes. If you want to look at more information about classes and stuff like that, you can see the types of stuff that we have talked about. These have changed a little bit. I'm not teaching that particular class. Anyway, so today we're going to be looking at your references for Project 1. I've looked at some already. I saw many of you have posted them, and so I'll be looking at those. We'll be doing that in the second half of the class, when I'll be coming around and trying to get a feel for what you're doing. One thing to remind you of is that this project isn't so much about creating an entire world or an entire thing, but it's about using design elements to create a composition. We are always thinking about design. We're always thinking about shapes and form and direction and organic values and linear values and tone and all those types of things, and we're creating a composition. On the back wall, you'll see that image of the bell tower, and it's made up of organic shapes. The bell tower is this organic type shape. It's got curves. Then you have straight. The girders of the roof and all that sort of stuff are straight. There's little details on things that capture light. So when you start building or creating your image, you'll only be using really a small part of it. So I want to make sure that we're not thinking too detailed, like, oh, this flaking paint and lots of debris and all that. That's just not going to be likely. You're not going to be making all that sort of stuff. That's outside. That's farther down the road. But buildings with recesses and the stuff that goes in, stuff that comes out, curves, shapes, all that sort of stuff, and more of a broad. Does that make sense? Now, some people do. I mean, we think about repetition. So you could take a single model that you really like and repeat it in a different, multiple ways, and then look at it from different angles and how it overlaps. And you can do a lot of, you can get a lot out of that, especially when you add light and all that sort of thing. So a lot of my comments will be, these are really good ideas. Remember to don't get too hung up on a lot of those intricate details. Focus on design principles, you know, and utilizing those types of things and do that. So that's what I try to. We're not necessarily modeling a specific thing. Like I'm not modeling a book or an umbrella or this or that necessarily, but what about the shapes of the umbrella? What about the shapes of the book or the design do you like that you are trying to then incorporate into something? Does that make sense? So we'll be doing that sort of thing. But today we're going to be, and this morning, what I want us to be doing is getting a feel for working in Maya. And so I don't want to do a lot of just direct verbatim lecture reading. I want to try to teach as we go, as we are working with the software, kind of like, you know, if anybody ever watched any painting shows like Bob Ross, anybody ever watched that? You know, he's talking to you. These are my thoughts. This is what I'm thinking. This is kind of how I'm preparing for this. And, you know, then demonstrating. And you kind of have to get into that. He doesn't talk necessarily about all the different brush types and all the different canvases and all the different chemicals that go into paints and all that sort of stuff. Those are other topics. He's kind of giving you a feel for a technique or a tool that he uses, but then what he's thinking about, you know, and why he's layering things in. So I kind of approach, I do a lot of, sometimes I want you to just watch so that you can kind of get the mystery of it taken away, and then learn how to kind of do it. You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of times when you're doing this for the first time, you don't really understand what it is or how any of this is done. And then I want to try to break it down into the basic component of what it is all about. You know, like can you just boil it down to a single thing, a manipulation of components of a polygonal object or whatever that is. So we will be working in Maya. So if you haven't already done so, we can bring Maya up and have that ready to go. The first thing we want to kind of talk about is the user interface, kind of what is it? Where are some of the key parts that we have? When Maya comes up, many of you will see this basic screen. So I would bring Maya up. Bailey, I would bring Maya up probably so you can have it on the screen. And in the notes for today, I have notes for the day. I actually closed the schedule here. So I'll be looking kind of like for right off the bat. We're just kind of breaking these down. What are the basic parts of the screen? What's the user interface? How we kind of navigate around? What is it for? And so I'm just going to be kind of going through some of these things as we go. So the Maya interface is pretty vast. It has a lot of information on it. It has a lot of menus and submenus that you have to kind of get used to navigating. The main areas where we do our work would be right here in this viewport here. This is where we do all of our world building and modeling and everything. Up across the top, we have our file menus here that are specific for different activities. So you have this little drop-down menu right here that will change the options that we have right here. So right now we have modeling options up. If I go to rigging, watch how this will change when I select that. Notice how we have tools specific for rigging. Now we aren't going to be rigging in this class. There's tools specific for for animation. There's tools specific for effects, etc., etc. When we're working, you got to make sure that you're in the proper menu set so that you get the right tools, right? So if you're looking for something and it's supposed to be up here, and I say go to mesh, edit mesh, and you don't see it, well, it might be because you don't have the right menu set selected, right? And so that's one thing you've got to be first set to make sure you understand. We have our basic new screens and open files and save files here. We have a lot of different options here. We'll get into that. Along the side here is what's called our tools, and these are our transform tools and our selection tools. These are selection tools, and these are different types of selection tools. They're basically three kinds that you can just click. You can click and drag around something with a selection tool. You can do a lasso, or you lasso around something, and then you can use a paintbrush and paint across the surface to select components of an object, which we'll get into in just a little bit. Then we have three main transformation tools. One is a transform, which is translate something. It's going to move X, Y, Z up and down. We're going to be able to, and that's called the move tool. We have a rotate tool, which we can rotate objects. And we have a scale tool, which will allow us to scale something in X, Y, and Z. So one of the cool things about our environment is we are working in the X, Y, and Z fields. And if you look in your main viewport, you can see down in the lower hand corner, there's a nice little set of crosshairs down there that show you the positive coordinates. So this is positive X, so values from 0 through 10, 20, 30, 40, whatever. This is going to go to the right of this point. The center is the 0, 0. So this is the world center. This is the center of the universe. Everything kind of begins at 0, 0, 0. Y is going up. So positive Y will take you from up. Negative Y will take you down. Positive Z will go this direction. And negative Z will go that direction. Does that make sense? And then any combination of 1 up and Y, 2 over and X, and 1 up and Z will put you in some coordinate point. Does that make sense? So high and so far up and so far over within that world. And we'll get into that in just a little bit. What's really cool is that there is more than just this one screen actually happening. When we look at this world, there's actually 4 cameras in this space. And if you put your mouse in your perspective view, notice that this says perspect, P-E-R-S-P, persp. That's for perspective. If you tap your space bar, you actually will break your viewport into 4 viewports, which are orthographic cameras. And it's really important to understand an orthographic camera is not a perspective camera. A perspective camera is calculating perspective. You know how see how it's kind of it looks like it's going off into the distance, versus these cameras are completely square and they're perfect side views of the world. So you can look at something in perfect. It's more like drafting. You know, if you ever drawn something in a drafting or a blueprint, you have these perfect kind of front, side, back, top kind of views. That's what orthographic views are. Now we can actually create new cameras and change different types of cameras if we want to add more. So we could actually make our own unique orthographic camera or our own unique perspective cameras and add that to the mix, and we can use those as well. We won't do that right now, but we will later on. Does that make sense? Everybody able to see all those things? Let's go ahead and look at a single object so we can kind of learn to maneuver within this space. So when we are working, so I'm going to put my mouse in my perspective camera. Let's practice moving around. So if I want to go to my perspective camera, I'm going to put my mouse in it and hit the space bar and it brings it up. If I want to go out, I hit the space bar and I put my mouse in another one. Now I'm in top Y. Hit the space bar, go back, hit the space bar, go back. So I can change that around. Every viewport has its own set of menus and its own set of options. Like if I want to turn off the grid and just the perspective, I can click that on and off. If I want to be able to see the what's called the camera gates or the film gates that show me what my camera actually will take a photograph of, I can turn on these little toggle switches and turn things on and turn things off. So those are things to remember, that every single one of these windows has the ability to kind of customize it to see what you want. You can also use more of a master control where you can go up to display and say, I don't want grid on anything. And I can go up and say grid display on off. If I want to turn them all off, I can do that. So I can say display and turn on my grid and change that. If I want to change the background colors in my scenes, I can hold down Alt and hit B and change that. Grade is default. Actually, there used to be a gradient. My gradient's not showing up, but okay. I go with kind of the light gray, or a gradient like on that screen. Mine isn't happening, so that's okay. There it is. A light blue. Oh, I was saying this light blue gradient wasn't showing up when I was toggling through the options. So,
what did you say you pressed to toggle?
oh, Alt D. Alt and tap the B button. So if you like a solid gray background or a black background or a this nice kind of color gradient, you can choose that. We can customize our grid and our values and our colors through different preferences, and we can access those things by going to what's called the option box. So every one of these sub-menus, well, not every one of them, many have a little square over to the side that's called an options box. And what that does is that will allow you to bring up options for that particular tool. In this particular case, these are the options for the grid. And if I wanted to change the grid to have a different color or something, say I wanted to add grid lines or change the axis color to something that is more pleasing or more colorful, I could change that and I could hit apply. And then if I don't like it, I can move it back. And so you can kind of, if I want to change my subdivision lines, I could do that by changing these things. And you'll probably want to have a better idea about what to change something to when you see what some of the common colors are. There's green and blue and some of these things that you wouldn't want your grid lines to. But anyway, those options are there. Again, did someone ask a question? It's under grid. It's under display, grid, and options box. Click on the options box and this options will come up. The options concept is very common and many of the tools have that. So when you see that little box, you'll see there's one all over the place, and this will give you the ability to change or modify the rules for that particular tool as you go. Does that make sense to everybody? Maya also has all kinds of UI elements that we can adjust or bring up. If you go under Windows and UI elements, you can see that there are all these little checkboxed items. So our toolbar that's on the left-hand side, if I check that, notice it's gone now. I can go back to Windows, Settings and Preferences, UI elements, and bring that back up. And I can pretty much bring up some of these elements that I may or may not need right now. I just want you to know that you can adjust these types of things. If something is missing, you might go to UI elements and look and see if they're unchecked. Some of them, like the time slider and the range slider, we don't really need those right now because we're not animating. Those are specific for animation, and we can remove those and give ourselves a little more real estate on the screen. So we can do that if we want to. If we want to bring them back, we can simply go back and say UI elements and check those if we like. Does that make sense to everybody? And also under the Windows and settings, Windows, settings and preferences, it allows us to have a whole ton of other options. So this goes very deep into kind of setting things up that you'll get into later on as you need them as we go. So there's selection settings and all kinds of stuff. I'm not going to go into the details of that right now. It's a little, but I just want you to know that those exist and that you can modify things as you need to later on. Does that make sense to everyone? Let's go ahead and look at some basic objects. When you are in the modeling sub-menu set, so your modeling set, make sure you have that selected. We have an area called the shelf, and the shelf is our iconical kind of representation of a tool. So we want to create something. We want to create a basic shape, a primitive. A basic primitive is an object, a primitive object, or a polygonal object that we can begin with. It's a primitive object, and that's usually a starting point in a lot of cases. So when we're up here, we can either look at these. This will make a primitive sphere, a cube, a cylinder, a cone, a torus, a plane, a disc, and then there are some fancy, some other things that we can make. So by simply clicking on one of those, let's make a cube. I click on a cube, and it puts a cube in the middle of my world. And it's set up that way to just create something at 0, 0, 0. There's another way to do it. I'm going to hit delete and just delete that cube. And I'm going to also go up to create. So think, when I want to make something, I'm going to be creating something. What am I going to create? I'm going to create a polygonal primitive. What kind of polygonal primitive? Well, here are all these options again. So I can also go to cube here, and here's this polygonal cube in my scene. Did everybody get that? You got a cube in your scene. When I choose, oops, go back to object mode. When I choose my object, it will illuminate with the green lines around it. It's just highlighting the edges of it. And you see how it's, when I'm not selected, it's just pale gray. And when I select it, it is green. If I want to frame in this image, this object, framing it in means the camera will just kind of jump right up to it. It's like getting closer to it almost instantly. I can hit the F key and it will snap forward to frame it in. That's what the F stands for, frame it in your camera. If I use my middle mouse and roll backwards on the button, by rolling back towards me, it'll pull the camera out, away from it. If I roll the middle mouse forward, it will move towards the object or move the camera forward. Think of the camera on a track, on a little train track, like they would move use in the movies, and they're pushing it forward and they're pulling it backward, and that's called tracking, and because it's on a track. If I hold down the Alt key and hold down my left mouse button inside my viewport and drag right or left, my camera is doing what's called tumbling. I can tumble around. I'm holding down my mouse button and the Alt key the entire time, and I'm tumbling around this object. Now, just like if you were in an airplane flying around, you got to keep an eye on your world axis. If you're upside down, you're going to look down in here and see that the positive Y, is pointing to the ground. Well, I'm upside down. I'm flying upside down. You got to be able to understand which direction you're going, so you have to keep your eye on your compasses so you're not modeling something in reverse or upside down. It's also good to keep things pretty square to the world axes, because it's hard to model things at different angles sometimes. Sometimes it's like you might have something skewed and you're trying to work on it. It's just like trying to work on a ladder on the overhang of your house or something, or under the car, where you're in this awkward position where everything is just kind of off. Things don't work quite right? It's just a little harder to do. You can do it, but you have to work harder to make it happen. So ideally, model things or work on things and up, straight down, and then take that and move it to a different position instead of trying to model it in that position. Does that make sense? So always kind of keep that in mind. You won't appreciate that until you do it wrong, and then you're struggling with it, and then you'll realize that it been a lot better to do it the other way. So here is my cube. Let's look at some of the tools Um, First of all, one thing that we want information. We want to understand what is this object, where is this object, and how we do that is look at what's called a channel box. A channel box is just a tab on the side here. Notice how I have these different tabs. There's modeling toolkit, there's attributes, and there's a channel box. You can toggle those by hitting Control A back and forth. So there's my attribute editor and there's my channel box. Control A, I'm holding down Control and hitting the A key, and I'm just kind of going back and forth, and I want to look at the channel box. When you look at an object like this object, it has, when it's created, it has a name. Maya gives it a name, and it's listed right here. It's called PCube1, PolyCube1. All right, that's the name it's given. You can change that name by going in here. I'm clicking and highlighting that, and I can just say my cube, and I can give it a unique name. And I can give it, we call this camel casing. When you do, you keep it, Maya prefers no space. You don't use a space. If you want a space between words, use an underscore or camel case. So I'm camel casing is lowercase, and then the next word is uppercase. So my is lowercase, cube is uppercase, my cube, and then if I wanted to name it something else, gray. All right, so notice how it's lower, uppercase, 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 or if I didn't want to do it that way, I could say my underscore cube underscore gray, whatever. Does that make sense? Those are acceptable naming conventions in Maya. And when you are making a scene or making your scene, I want you to label your object so that you know what it is. Because here's what happens. You begin to build in your scene. If you click over here on this side, there are some what's called the outliner. And the outliner begins to lay out all of the objects that are in your scene that you may not know are in your scene. So my cube is listed right there. These are the different cameras that are in my scene. Here's my perspective camera. Here's the information about it, where it's located in X, Y, and Z, its rotation values. So I clicked on this icon right here. This will toggle it on and off, and that's called your outliner. And that's one of those things that you can bring up by usually clicking on all of these different things that you want. I typically will just go here for that or bring it up. So the outliner will help you look at the different things in your scene. So here is my Gregg Cube, and you can see it's selected with a blue highlight on it. And over here are the different values. Currently it is located at 0, 0, 0, 0 in X, 0 in Y. It's not rotated at all, no rotations on any of those axes, and its scale is 1, meaning it is 0 would be so small nothing, and 1 is just 1 unit in every direction. Does that make sense? If I want to move this, I can move it a couple different ways. First of all, the easiest is probably just to do a shortcut, which is W. If I hit the W key, that brings up notice that this icon illuminates my move or my transform tool, my move tool. And if I grab this by the handles, notice that there are 3 handles. A Z handle pointing down the Z axis. See the Z axis down here? It's hard to see. The X axis going down the positive X, and the Y axis going up in the positive Y. If I grab that, notice how the values begin to change as I move it in X. Now it's moving based on the middle of the object. So if I look at my orthographic view, you can see that this object is actually being moved by an origin point, an origin or what's called a pivot point in the center of the object. So all the transformations, the scale, the rotations, the transformations are happening based on that point. And we can change that if we want to. We'll do that in a little bit. And sometimes that can be advantageous for how we want to orient this. So let's click on the next icon, which is rotate, or we can hit the E key. So one of the things to remember is QWERTY. The QWERTY keys, Q, W, E, R, T. Uh, Q is just selection. So notice how there's no move or transform widget or anything sticking up. So when that thing is in your way, when this is in your way, hit Q, and that will remove it. See how when I hit W, I get transform. When I hit E, I get the rotation tool. And when I hit R, I get what's called the scale tool. But if I hit Q, that'll kind of clear those out. And that thing can get in your way. And sometimes it can get in your way when you're trying to select smaller components. Everybody able to see that? So I can quickly choose transform or my move tool by hitting W, E, or R. Now I'm going to hit W, and I'm going to move it in one direction in X. I can move it in Z. I can move it in Y. If I grab it in the middle, I'm going to move it in all the directions because it's really hard to see and move it in one direction when you grab it in the center. Notice that all my number values are changing. So if I might think I'm moving it just in X, but I'm really not. I'm really dragging. It's because our hands are shaky. We can't move in a perfect perspective. Now, if I move it in orthographic views, that helps kind of keep me a little more organized. Or I can choose a value. So for instance, if I want to, I could go over here and type in 0 and put it back in the world. I could say move 10 units in X. I could say move 5 units in X, 5 units in Y, and 5 units in Z. And you can see that it places it in all those. So here's my quadrant. I'm in 5, 5, and 5. Does that make sense to everybody? The same thing with orientation. I'm going to move it back to 0, 0, 0. And I'm going to go back to my perspective view. And I'm going to frame it in again. And then I'm going to hit E. And I'm going to rotate again around X, around Z, and around Y by clicking on the handle. And I'm going to hit R and I'm going to scale. Now, I can scale in only X, only Z, only Y. And you can see that the values change because I'm not changing them all uniformly. If I go back to 1, now what I like and what I typically do is use the world or the uniform, which is in the middle. Notice how that there's a yellow, well, it's actually that there's a, I have it selected so it's yellow. There's a green, a red, and a blue icon, but in the middle there's this light blue one. See this light blue? This is uniform scaling. And when I scale stuff, typically I will apply uniform scaling so that I'm scaling in all 3 units. Does that make sense? So it's just this middle. Notice it's light blue in the center. Go to R, the R key, so I'm in the scale. There you go. All right. So we can choose an object, select which transformation tool we want to use, and we can use the widget or the handles here to move them. I can type in a value, say I want that to be 2 units. One more way, and one that I use a lot, and remember the scale value is 1, not 0. If I said 0, it would be, it's not gone, it's just a value of 0. It still exists, see, it's over here, but it's just a value of 0. If I select all of 3 of these units and type in one value, then I will get that value for all of the units. Or I can do it one at a time. I find that to be a quick way to my mistake. A quick way to do that. Does that make sense to everybody? One other thing that you can do, and I use this method a lot, is to transform based on the name. So if I click on the name, let's say I want to translate in X, and I go over to my viewport and I middle mouse hold, I can do what's called a virtual slider. So I'm holding down my middle mouse button and I'm dragging right and left and I'm sliding it just in that direction, just in this direction, just in this direction, and that's just another quick way to kind of do it. That way I'm not trying to drag it like this. You can figure out which way works best for you. You'll come up with your own ways over time. That's just something that I do. I'm going to put everything back at the origin. And I want you to practice that a little bit. Let's practice moving something around, creating some objects. So let's create a few objects here, move them around. Use your camera to look around your scene, your orthographic camera to look around your scenes. See how things get overlapped when you look at them from the side? And practice kind of moving back and forth, camera to camera, object to object. We'll do that for a few minutes. Go ahead.
How did you do the translate X thing again?
So you select the, instead of selecting the number or the numeric value, select the name.
Right.
And then I go over here and I hold down my middle mouse button and I just drag. Yeah, it's the middle mouse. Yeah. So the three camera moves that we will be using is tumbling. So Alt left mouse drag, tumble. If you hit Alt middle mouse, will take you up, will raise the camera up and down. I'm raising it. And then the right, if I roll the middle mouse, I move forward, or if I hold down Alt and drag the right mouse button, hold it down, I can track in and out. So this is called dollying. It's on a dolly or like a crane. This is called tracking, where you're, or tumbling, tumbling around the object, tumble. And then we are going to track in and out. So practice those three things. And we're going to then practice constructing something where we have to actually utilize moving cameras around, creating objects. Yeah, you can. So if you right click on your object, you have object mode. And object mode is basically saying, look, let's think of this as just what it is. It's an object. It's a sphere. It's not so much made up of all these different parts. It's just a sphere. Now, when we get into component mode, we can actually modify the sphere by modifying the ingredients or the components or the structural components of it. So this sphere is actually made up of a bunch of what's called vertices. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but a vertex or a vertice is actually one of the structural components of the object. So in a polygonal object, we have what's called a vertex, which is a point, an edge, which is an edge that connects two vertices, and a face, which is the plane that is created by the creation of edges. So this is made up of a bunch of vertices, like a dot to dot. So I'm going to hit my Q button to remove that. So I can select these vertices, and these edges here connect the vertices, and what's created is a plane, which is this face. Does that make sense? I have the ability to modify or change the shape of the sphere by modifying the locations of the vertices, by modifying the location of the edges, or by modifying the location or shape of the face. And when you do that a lot, you can change and transform the whole structure of the object. Does that make sense? So when you talk about a low poly object, like this sphere has actually got a lot of components to it. It's actually got 20 units in one direction. I can add to that. I modified a little bit. So we're going to talk more about that because that's what we're going to be basically modifying and working with. Right now we're just basically getting our footing, getting an understanding of working within our user interface and flying around the world. And so let's try something. Everybody feel like they're a little comfortable with the selections and the maneuvering, moving around of the within the space? Everybody okay with that? Anybody need any specific help in that area that you need me to help you with? All right. So one of the things you need to do is to learn how to look at the world in order to make a structure or make an object of some sort. I see many of you are doing that, and that's great so far. So let's begin with a simple plane. So I'm going to go up to my modeling menu set. I'm going to go over to here, which is going to create a little plane. So that's a little polygonal plane. I'm going to create a plane on the ground.
How do you delete the object?
It's got to be.
Start over.
It's got to be. Just hit the. There you go. And I'm going to scale this up a little bit. So I'm just going to hit the R button, or I could just go over and scale it up. But I'm just going to do a uniform scale and just kind of increase the size to like 5 or something, or 5 or 6. I'm not too picky about that. This is a plane, a polygonal plane. Okay. So once I have that, I can quickly make a duplicate of it by hitting Control D. And notice over here what has happened. P plane 1 is now P plane 2, and there are 2 objects in my scene. Let me show you. Watch this. Here's P plane 1. I'm going to hit Control D. Now there's P plane 2. But what happens is they're in exactly the same location they're a duplicate of the last one. So it exists, you just can't really tell because they're totally in the same spot. So what I want to do is rotate it. So I can either go in and say I'm going to rotate around X, or rotate around X. It's just easy to say rotate 90 degrees around X. So I've made a back wall, if you will. Oops. I hit the letter instead of I was over here. And I can move that back a little bit. Basically just doing something like this. Now I could raise it up if I want to. And notice it's really, really, really hard to tell sometimes. I'm going to raise this above the floor. Notice that when it's just at 0, 0, 0, you can see the grid on top of it. I'm just going to raise it up. This is where you kind of start to learn to utilize these different views. Notice I'm going to lower it below this line. This is the horizontal axis. And notice that in this view, you can see what happens. When I'm above the line, no grid. When I'm below the line, I see the grid above it. And that's kind of confusing sometimes. Does that make sense? So I'm going to put this on the floor just like it's a floor. And I'm just going to put it just above the grid. If I want to do incremental, I can hold down the Alt key and hit my up arrow. And if I tap my up arrow, I can go really small units in Y or X, or I can't really do Z, not at this angle. Does that make sense? So if I need to, I could type in a value, or I could move it. So I'm going to just move it so that grid isn't right there. I'm going to take that one. And remember, I have one on the ground right here. And since they're planes, they're hard to kind of see. So you might want to use my orthographic view to kind of line things up. So I could put this here, move it down a little bit, and I'm not going to be too worried about it. I'll crisscross them here in the back. And then I can take this back wall, and I can hit Control D. I can rotate it, and I can rotate it around Y 90 degrees. And then I can move that over to the edge just like I've done here, and I'm using my orthographic views to crisscross these things as well. So I've kind of made a generic little room with just walls. Remember, this is like a movie set, you know? When you go to the theater, you have partial walls. You have the idea of a room. We're not building an entire room for this. We don't need it. We always have to be thinking about that. There's other ways I could have used this. I could have created a cube and just deleted some faces and done a similar thing. Does that make sense? And then, so I have plane 1, which I'll call my ground. I'll just call ground. I have plane 2, which I will call my back wall.
How did you get plane 2 again?
Hold on, back wall. So I control D. Control D will duplicate. And then I'll call this my side wall or left wall or whatever you want to call it. So notice over here I have ground, back wall, side wall. Does that make sense? Then I can create another cube, which will be right here in my world. And I can place that. I can scale it up if I want using the scale and Y. If I want to make it a little bit bigger, that's totally fine. And I can set that kind of in my room. And I can adjust these as much as I need to make them bigger or smaller. Maybe just scale this down a little bit. Make it a little smaller in that space. Is everybody able to do that? Does that make sense? So working with orthographic views, I'm just going to hide some of my grids here. Anybody able to do that? Okay. All right, get you. So on this pedestal here in your space, this is where I want you to begin building structures. Now think about it like an artist, like you're walking through Meadowbrook Park. Anybody been to Meadowbrook Park? And they have all these interesting structures, you know, and they're made out of usually geometric shapes, you know, cones and cubes and spheres and toruses, all the kinds of stuff that we have access to right here. And that's the idea. You're going to create an art type of sculpture. And again, the reason I like this one is because it's simple enough, but it has sharp, straight lines, and then this helix. I think it's a helix. Yeah. And then this is taking different shapes, but it also is using this idea of weight. You know, you're looking at it from the below, and it feels like something is heavier than something else. It has this little bit of direction and design. Things are moving and they're flowing along this object, and it's doing a lot of duplication. So you can actually create a single object. So here's a torus. So a torus looks like a donut. And many of these, and I'll just give you a little we can use our basic tools to scale things down, and there is another to scale things down and to move things around. There's another handy feature that can come in handy when you're working in this world, and that is to see the world in what's called a wireframe. So notice that this is all shaded right here. Sometimes, if a wall is in the way, like this wall is in my way, at least it feels like it, you can use your number keys. So on the keyboard, you have a bunch of numbers on the right-hand side. And make sure it's on by hitting the number lock button. You should see a little blue, in my case, there's little blue lights that come on. Number 4 will allow me to go into what's called wireframe. So if I hit 4, I can see all the wires or just the edges of this polygonal object. So I can see it with all the shading. If I hit 5, I get the shading back, and I can see these the objects like that. So sometimes if I'm looking at something in an orthographic view, to see everything in my scene. See, now I can see my torus, I can see all the planes, and I can see that cube right there. So I knew it was in there, but I couldn't really tell where it was sitting. Does that make sense? So that's a very handy thing to be able to do too. It's kind of like being able to go. Now this torus has some interesting information available to it over here in the channel box. The channel box is here, and it has what's called inputs. And every object that we're creating has information that defines its shape. Those are the kind of the options when this thing is being created. So we get a little feeling of what that looks like right here, and we'll get into more of this later on. But the radius of this object, is, if I change the value, and I'm going to do that middle slider technique that I told you about a little bit earlier, where I select the name and drag, because this is a very good way to kind of see it. I can drag back and forth and see what happens when that radius value changes. Section radius is going to make it smaller or fatter around the tube, like an inner tube on your bike tire. Twist is just going to change the components around there. You won't see much. And then if you want something to be less polygonal, I can take away these edges. So the more of these I have, the smoother and smoother it gets. The less I have, the more. So the smallest value is like a triangle. So I can get a lot of different shapes out of just kind of searching through here. Also the same way this way. So you can modify these things by working with all these different variations of this of the inputs, or what's called basically the component values, or the information that's making up what this object is. And so if you were wanting to create something with an object like this, and you didn't want it to be super fat, and you wanted it to be more round, you could then take that shape and modify it and start to build your structure on your surface. So it can be very confusing at first when you begin to start working with these things. So I tend to, like I say, start looking at the world, and sometimes the grid is annoying and I don't need it all the time. So sometimes knowing where things are orthographically is helpful to try to place my object. If I wanted to put it right in the middle of this, I might want to look at it from the top. I might want to look at it from the side or from the front, so I can see where it is, and then also from the side, so I can make sure everything is lined up the way that I want. Does that make sense? If I wanted to, I could Control D, duplicate that, and hit E, and then begin to rotate this and start to build. You don't Control D, maybe I rotate that, maybe I move it a little bit, and I can start to build structures. Now, with that, I already have some interesting forms that if I was close to it, I have some pretty cool shapes already, and I can explore some of these things just by getting close. What's cool is I can actually go into those shapes sometimes. I can go into the inside of an object. If I want to, I can grab and hold Shift, select, and if I move all these, I can move them all together, but if I try to rotate them, they're going to rotate along. Well, actually, that actually worked pretty well. So I can move some of them around if I want to. And I can start to kind of construct something on that surface. Now, once I duplicate this, I do actually lose the inputs. These won't have them anymore because I've lost that. I can adjust this one, but right now, that makes sense to everybody? Kind of building a structure. So I always like to look at references and stuff like that. I see some, yeah, very nice. So I want you to do more than just a single object. Work with duplication, repeating, design where things might be moved a little bit. So this is going to be the shape study, and what you're going to want to do is, and I'll show you in a minute. You're going to create a camera that we will put in place, and that will be the camera that you don't typically fly around in, but it's the camera that you're taking the picture with. That way you don't move it. What you'll do is you'll end up saving your scene, just like we're doing. We'll save that scene as a shape study, and that's what you'll submit. We're not going to make a project folder for this one. We'll just save it as a single Maya file, an MB file. But you'll want to have your camera in place so that you have kind of a selection of the point of view. So before we go today, you'll put your object on display, and we can all walk around and see what other people have been making while we are in lab. So if you need to take a break right now, would be a good time. And I'm going to start looking at your references for project 1. Some of you have already answered, responded to your inputs and your images, and some of you I haven't yet. So I'm going to try to get through those. But while we're all here, if I don't get to you, I will answer through Cobra and go through it that way and tell you my thoughts. But I'm going to try to get through everybody. Sure. I'm going to delete that. So here we are in our perspective view. Every panel has these menus, right? These panels menus. And if I want to turn one of these panels into a different camera, I can go into the perspective type camera I want and say new. So you notice I'm going to click on new, and it's going to create a new perspective camera for me. Now I'm looking through that camera in this channel right here, or this viewport right here. And if I want to go back to the original perspective camera, I can select it to look through that camera. Here it is. This is the old perspective camera. This is the new perspective camera. And I have then the controls. I can move that camera, or I can drive the camera like I'm flying it like this. So if you look at what happens when I'm flying around here, it's updating in these other windows. So I can fly it around and kind of find a space that I'm interested in by either doing it this way, or I can use the controls in another perspective window to kind of move it in and out, up and down, and I can rotate it too. If I want to change, I'm going to rotate it, move it looking up and down. And sometimes it's when you are moving things like this, and this goes for objects. Notice how the camera is all at a different orientation than the controls, right? I want to move it right and left, but the camera, or move it forward. But when I'm moving it forward, I'm really moving it kind of at an angle. Now, every object has what's called its its own axes. So if I double click on my tool control here for move, double click it, I get tool settings. So look again, double click on my tool settings here. The axis orientation has to do with, is the axis that I'm going to be working with going to be oriented to the world or to the object itself? So right now it's on the world, but if I choose object, look how it aligns with the front and back of that camera. This is way more natural, like you would be moving a camera like this, not holding a camera and moving it in a different direction. So just like every object, like we have a top, and, I consider this my up, right? But if I'm laying on the ground, there's my up, which is my head, but the world up, which is still up and down like that, right? So objects have the ability to, once you change their orientation, to use their own orientation, which is object, or the world's orientation. And sometimes one is better than the other depending on how you want to move it. Because this camera is at this angle, it's easier to push it forward along its object orientation, not the world. See how the world is X is Z, I'm moving in Z and moving in X? That doesn't work very well for this type of movement. Do you see what I'm saying? So sometimes, a lot of times, I'm switching back and forth between the object orientation and the world orientation because it helps me move things in a more efficient manner. But once I have my camera here in my scene, then I can move it around and I can create, and I use these orthographic views, top, side, front, to help me kind of see where and what I'm looking at. Now, you can do that, or you can just fly around it by flying the camera, uh, and I can also frame that in a little bit more. When you select something and you frame it in, the camera will rotate more nicely around that if you find it. Does that make sense? So what I want you to do is take your camera and move it into a spot that you think is very interesting. Maybe you've discovered some movement or rotation, or sorry, movement or rhythm. And that's where I want you to park that camera. So we can kind of look at the world. So I can look at perspective, and I can go to your camera, whatever you can call it, my shot or shot number 1. I usually say shot 1, shot 2, shot 3, and I can label that. So I select my camera here, like I'm selecting an object in the scene, and I can name it shot 1. And then I can have these different points of view. Does that make sense? So object view and world view, or sorry, not object view, or axis orientation, world orientation, those are things that you will be using for not only your camera, but also your objects in your scene. So what I want you to do is work on this, work on your scene. You can put in multiple cameras too. If you want to put in multiple cameras and have different shots, that's fine as well. But ultimately, I want you to be thinking about building a composition, working through your scene, working with objects, moving them around, scaling them, and getting comfortable making or working with all of those tools so that when we begin making stuff, you are fairly comfortable moving around 3D space. Any questions about that? You're going to save your scene. So you're going to say, when we save this, I'm just going to say File, and I'm going to say Save, and I'm going to save mine to my desktop right now, and then I'm going to move it to my OneDrive. So I'm going to say, this is shape, so it's your first initial last name, camel case, so this is mine, and this is going to be called Shape Study, and then the file type is the Maya binary, and it should be put on there automatically, but I'm just going to add it myself. And then when I save this, I'm making sure I know it's going to my desktop, and I want to save it. It should then give me a file right here. So here is my file that I would then want to submit. But I'm going to let you work on this over the weekend, so it's not due until Monday, because I want you to practice. I want you to work on, this is your one-off kind of thing. Practice making it better, getting better at it, getting more comfortable with it. Does that make sense? So you can build your composition, add to it, make it more if you want, look for better camera angles and that sort of thing. All right, next week when we get in, we're going to start manipulating and working with polygons, more polygonal objects, and more directly. Right now we're just utilizing the basics. And then we'll get into a little bit more of all those things and go into some other really interesting features in Maya. You guys have a great day, and I'll see you next Monday. Nope, not Monday. We have